Gemini, welcome back to the channel. I'm really happy we're getting the chance to sit down together once again. If you happen to click on this video today, there's a good chance you may be needing a quiet moment in the middle of everything that's been moving through your mind lately. As I was preparing for this reading, what stood out the most wasn't chaos or dramatic change. It was the image of someone standing in front of an important decision. Someone who has spent a long time thinking, a long time weighing things carefully, and maybe wondering whether they already have all the answers they need. As always, this is a general and reflective reading, so take what resonates with your journey and gently leave behind anything that doesn't. With that being said, let's see what story the cards want to unfold for Gemini today. There are seasons in life when you suddenly notice your phone seems to be buzzing more than usual. Not because anything dramatic is happening. People just seem to be reaching out to you more often. One person wants your opinion about a decision they haven't been able to make. Someone else needs a listening ear before they take an important step. And sometimes, a conversation that starts out simple ends with a familiar question. What do you think I should do? Gemini, you often find yourself in that role. Not because you're trying to be everyone's guide, but because you have a way of seeing different sides of the same story. While other people may get stuck looking at a situation from one angle, you tend to notice what's living in the spaces in between. You hear what they're saying. You also notice what they're not saying. You hear the story being told, and sometimes you can feel the story that's being left out. That may be why the Four of Swords card comes through right at the beginning of this reading. It doesn't carry the feeling of someone in the middle of a battle. It feels more like someone who has just stepped out of a room filled with voices. Someone quietly closing the door behind them, not to escape, but to finally hear their own thoughts again. Because there's something interesting about people who spend so much time helping others find answers. They can sometimes be the ones who struggle the most to hear their own. When you've grown used to considering every angle, when you've grown used to holding space for multiple emotions at the same time, your mind can become a very busy place, almost like a crowded intersection during rush hour. One thought barely passes before another one arrives. One possibility pulls you forward. Another keeps you standing where you are. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, you may have been thinking about something important lately. Not necessarily a decision that would change the world, but one that matters deeply in your own life, a choice, a direction, a conversation that needs to happen, a doorway that has already opened, yet you're still standing there, taking it all in. The Ace of Swords card appears here like a breath of fresh air after days of gray skies. What's interesting is that this card doesn't seem to bring more information. It doesn't suggest that you need to do more research. It doesn't suggest that you need to ask more people for advice. It doesn't suggest that you need to keep searching. Instead, it quietly offers a different possibility. What if the answer you've been looking for has been there longer than you realize? What if the challenge isn't a lack of information? What if it's about learning to trust what you already know? Because Gemini, it's rarely a lack of intelligence. It's rarely a lack of awareness. And it's rarely a lack of insight. What often creates hesitation is your ability to see so many possibilities at once. And that's where the Two of Swords card enters the story. Not as a dead end, but as the feeling of standing between two roads that both make sense. You can see the value in this choice. You can also see the value in the other one. You could debate both sides with yourself for hours, only to discover another perspective that makes everything even more layered. Yet, there are moments in life when clarity doesn't arrive by opening another door. It arrives when you pause in front of all the doors that are already open, just for a moment, long enough to notice which voice belongs to the world around you, and which voice belongs to you. That feels like where this reading begins. Not with action, not with a dramatic shift, but with a pause. Like someone standing by a window at the end of a long day, watching distant lights reflect against the glass. Life continues moving outside. Everything keeps going. Yet somewhere within, a thought is beginning to surface. A quiet thought. One that isn't trying to convince you of anything. One that isn't demanding attention. Just patiently waiting to be heard. And perhaps that quiet space is where the next part of this story begins to unfold. There's something interesting about people who spend a lot of time thinking. They often believe that if they give themselves just a little more time, they'll finally see the piece they've been missing. It's a bit like standing in your favorite bookstore in front of a shelf full of possibilities. You've already picked up a few books. You've read the descriptions. You've compared your options. And yet, before heading to the checkout counter, part of you still wants to take one more lap around the store. Maybe there's a book that's an even better fit. Maybe there's a better option. Maybe you've overlooked something important. That's not necessarily indecision. A lot of the time, it's simply the way the Gemini mind works. You are given the ability to see possibilities that other people don't immediately notice. In a conversation, you can often pick up on multiple layers of meaning at the same time. In a situation, you may already be imagining several possible outcomes before someone else has even considered the first one. That's a gift. But there are days when that gift can feel like a room with too many open doors. Every door leads to a different future. Every future comes with its own reasoning, and every reason sounds convincing. Before long, your mind is moving from one doorway to another, not because you don't know what you want, but because you can understand why every option exists in the first place. Maybe you've had afternoons like that. You're still getting your work done, still replying to messages, still having conversations. From the outside, everything looks completely normal. Yet no one can see how many conversations are happening inside your head at the same time. Life keeps moving, everything continues as usual. It's just that your energy is being pulled in several directions at once. What makes this reading feel so meaningful is that it doesn't carry the feeling of needing to keep chasing all of those voices. Instead, it feels like someone stepping out of a crowded room and into the cool evening air. The noise is still there behind them, but for the first time in a long while, they can hear the sound of their own footsteps. We live in a time when everyone seems to have an opinion about everyone else's life. Open your phone for a few minutes and you'll find dozens of perspectives on the same situation. One person tells you to be bold, another tells you to be careful. Someone says not to miss the opportunity. Someone else warns you not to take the risk. Listen long enough, and every piece of advice starts to sound reasonable. And that's often when the most important voice gets buried. Your own. The Four of Swords card comes through here, with a very different feeling than people might expect. It doesn't feel lonely, it feels restful. Not rest because you're exhausted. Rest because you're trying to hear more clearly. It's like turning off the radio while you're searching for an unfamiliar address. There's nothing wrong with the music, but sometimes you need silence to figure out where you are. The Ace of Swords card carries a similar energy. Not loud, not dramatic. Not the kind of moment where everything suddenly lights up like a scene from a movie. It feels more like realizing something that has been sitting quietly in front of you all along. A simple thought, a simple truth. Something you've heard many times before but never fully stopped to listen to. Sometimes clarity doesn't arrive as a brand new answer. Sometimes it arrives as recognition. Recognizing what's been draining your energy. Recognizing what's been keeping you stuck. Recognizing what truly matters among all the options competing for your attention. And recognizing that not every voice deserves the same level of authority. Some voices come from fear, some come from pressure, some come from other people's expectations. And beneath all of that, there is often another voice, a quieter one, calmer, slower, less interested in arguing, less interested in interrupting. Yet it's always there, waiting for things to become quiet enough to be heard. And sometimes that moment opens the door to a question that runs even deeper than deciding which path to take next. There's a kind of exhaustion that's difficult to put into words. It doesn't feel like the fatigue that comes after a long day of work, and it doesn't feel like the grogginess that follows too many late nights. It shows up when you've been thinking about the same question for far too long. Every time you feel like you're getting a little closer to an answer, another perspective appears. Another detail, another possibility, another thing to consider. Gemini tends to be incredibly good in situations like that. If life were a chessboard, you would often be the person who sees more moves than everyone else around you. You don't just think about the next step. You think about what could happen after that. And after that, that ability can save you from a lot of rushed decisions. It can help you notice things that other people might miss. But there are moments when that gift quietly turns into a circle. You step into it looking for an answer, only to find more paths the deeper you go. Maybe you've experienced that feeling before. Sitting in your car long after you've turned off the engine. Standing in the kitchen, holding a cup of coffee that has already gone cold. Opening one website, then 5 more. Not because you don't know what to do, but because part of you is still searching for something better. A clearer sign. A stronger sense of certainty. A reason powerful enough to silence every remaining doubt. The thing is, life rarely works that way. Most meaningful decisions don't arrive with a complete map in your hands. They tend to arrive when you can only see the first few steps ahead. That's the feeling the Two of Swords card carries in this part of the reading. Not the image of someone who has no options, quite the opposite. It feels like someone standing in the middle of too many options that all seem reasonable. The hesitation isn't coming from a lack of answers. It's coming from the desire to find the best answer out of every possible answer. There are periods when Gemini can spend an enormous amount of energy trying to make sure no mistake is made. You read more, research more, observe more, analyze more, and every part of that process seems justified. Until one day you realize you've been standing in the same place longer than you intended. Meanwhile, life keeps moving. New seasons arrive, opportunities change shape. Doors open and close in their own time. The Knight of Swords card comes through here like a strong wind moving through a room that has been closed for too long. Not to rush you, not to pressure you, but to remind you that sometimes action is what creates clarity. A lot of people believe clarity comes first and action comes second. Yet life often unfolds the other way around. You take one step, then the second step reveals itself. You open a door, then you discover the hallway behind it. You begin a conversation, then you realize what you truly wanted to say. Part of maturity isn't about always making the perfect choice. It's about accepting that no one gets to see the entire picture before the journey begins. Maybe the most frightening thing isn't choosing wrong. Maybe it's staying too long in the land of assumptions, a place where every road exists in the mind, yet none of them are ever experienced in real life. Gemini has always been a sign that thrives through movement. You learn through experience. You grow through what happens in front of you. You discover yourself by engaging with life rather than standing on the sidelines of it. And sometimes that very first step teaches more than hundreds of hours of thinking ever could. Not because thinking isn't valuable, but because there are lessons that only appear once your feet begin to move. There are answers that reveal themselves only after you're willing to move forward without seeing the entire road. There are doors that open only for those willing to leave the familiar hallway behind. And perhaps before any real movement begins, there's still another layer waiting beneath all of these thoughts. A quieter layer, a more personal one. One that has been sitting patiently underneath the analysis, waiting for its turn to be heard. There's something many people don't fully understand about Gemini. People often assume you change quickly. They assume you're adaptable. They assume you're comfortable in every conversation you step into. And to some extent, that's true. You have a way of moving between different worlds without making anyone feel out of place. You can sit with someone who enjoys silence and find common ground. A few hours later, you can find yourself in a completely different group, surrounded by completely different stories, and still feel at home. You understand how people think. You understand what brings them joy. You understand what hurts them. And sometimes you even understand the things they never say out loud. That's a gift. But every gift comes with a cost that isn't always visible. Because when you can see so many perspectives, you begin to understand the reasons behind people's actions. You understand why one person reacted the way they did. You understand why someone else feels disappointed. You understand the wounds they may be carrying beneath the surface. And naturally, something inside you starts wanting things to be easier for everyone. You try to find an answer that doesn't hurt anyone, a choice everyone can accept, a path that leaves no one disappointed. It sounds beautiful, it sounds kind, yet life doesn't always unfold that way. There are evenings when you're lying on the couch after a long day, your phone still glowing on the table beside you, a message you haven't answered yet, a conversation that's still unfinished, a decision that's still waiting to be made. Not because you don't know what you think, but because you're thinking about how everyone else might feel. You imagine their reactions. You imagine the questions they might ask. You imagine the silence that could follow. And often, that's the part that creates hesitation, not the decision itself, the emotional weight that comes after it. The Four of Cups card carries a very human feeling here. It feels like someone sitting quietly with more on their mind than anyone around them realizes. Not because they don't care, quite the opposite, because they care so much. Sometimes so much that they forget they are part of the equation too. There are seasons of growth that don't come from learning something new. They come from recognizing the limits of what you're responsible for. You can be kind. You can listen. You can do your best to move through life with respect and sincerity. But you cannot live other people's emotions for them. You cannot carry responsibility for every reaction someone has to an honest choice. And that's one of the hardest lessons to learn, especially for people who feel things deeply, because you're often able to see someone else's sadness before you notice your own exhaustion. The Ace of Swords card appears here with a very different kind of clarity, not like lightning striking the sky, more like standing in front of a mirror and finally being honest with yourself. No extra explanations, no softening the truth to make it easier to hear, no trying to make everyone comfortable, just honesty. Because some decisions in life aren't really about choosing between right and wrong. They're about choosing between what feels true and what simply keeps everyone comfortable for a little while longer. Maturity often begins when we stop measuring a good decision by how many people agree with it. Because sometimes the right choice still disappoints someone. Sometimes an honest answer still makes someone uncomfortable. Sometimes moving forward means accepting that not everyone wants to walk in the same direction. And that doesn't automatically mean you've done something wrong. Gemini spends so much time trying to understand other people. This reading feels like a gentle reminder of something equally important. There are moments when you deserve that same understanding from yourself, for the things you genuinely want, for the boundaries that need protecting, for the inner voice that has stepped aside more times than it should to make room for everyone else's expectations. And as some of that pressure begins to loosen its grip, another feeling slowly starts to emerge. A feeling that has less to do with what everyone else thinks, and more to do with what becomes possible when you finally commit to your own choice. There are days when life changes not because something dramatic happens. No fireworks. No life-changing scene. No one standing beside you, cheering you on. Just a quiet decision made in an ordinary moment. An email gets sent. An offer gets accepted. One door opens. Another quietly closes. From the outside, it all seems very simple. But the person living through that moment knows the real significance isn't found in the action itself. It's found in the fact that they've finally stopped standing in the middle of the crossroads. Gemini is often known for being incredibly adaptable. You can change direction when you need to. You can learn something new very quickly. You can spot opportunities in places other people never think to look. Yet because you're able to see so many possibilities, staying committed to one path can sometimes become its own challenge. Not because you lack determination, but because some part of your mind never stops noticing the roads you didn't take, even after you've chosen, even after you've started. A small voice can still whisper, "Was there a better option? Did I miss something? Should I go back and think about it one more time?" That's why the energy of this part of the reading feels so different. It no longer feels like searching. It feels like commitment. The Ace of Wands card appears here like the first flame catching after a long time spent preparing the wood. The flame isn't large. It doesn't need to be. What matters is that it has been lit. Because from that moment forward, something begins to shift. An idea starts becoming an experience. There's a huge difference between thinking about a journey and actually stepping onto the train. In our minds, we can control everything. In real life, we learn how to live alongside uncertainty. And that's often where many people stop. Not because they're incapable, but because they're waiting for complete certainty before allowing themselves to move forward. The truth is, that feeling rarely arrives. Most meaningful things in life begin with some degree of uncertainty. A new job, a new project, a new environment, a new chapter. You don't know everything. You simply know you've spent enough time thinking to take one more step. The Nine of Wands card brings through a very familiar feeling. It feels like day 30 of a new commitment. The excitement of the beginning has faded. The burst of motivation isn't as strong as it once was. The novelty has worn off. What remains is showing up, waking up and continuing, keeping a promise to yourself even when nobody else sees it. A lot of people underestimate the power of that. They believe success comes from huge moments of inspiration, but most of life is built through small actions repeated over and over again. A phone call gets made, another page gets written. Another step is taken down the road you've chosen. Another day passes without turning around to debate the decision all over again. Gemini is often used to exploring life through the mind. This part of the story carries a different feeling. It feels like building. Because exploration helps you discover possibilities. Commitment is what turns those possibilities into something real. There are versions of our future that only reveal themselves when we stay with a choice long enough to see the first results, long enough to move through the days when motivation feels distant, long enough to understand that the true value was never found in the beginning. It's found in continuing. And maybe that's the most beautiful part of this chapter. Not the action itself, not even the effort, but the peace that begins to appear when you stop trying to convince yourself. You simply keep walking, one step at a time. And within that steady rhythm, a much larger picture slowly begins to emerge ahead of you. There are moments when we don't truly understand the significance of a decision until years later. Not on the day it was made, not during the first week, but on some ordinary afternoon when life has moved far enough forward for us to finally see the invisible threads connecting the past to the present. You're sitting in a familiar home, or driving down a road you've traveled countless times, or watching the people you love laughing around a dinner table, and suddenly it hits you. So much of what exists in front of you today began with a choice that once seemed very small. A phone call, a simple yes, a decision that no one fully understood at the time. That feels like the heart of this part of the reading. Because not every choice is only about the present moment. Some choices are like a stone dropped into a still lake. The moment it touches the water lasts only a second. The ripples continue long after. Gemini tends to live close to the present. You enjoy new conversations, new ideas, new experiences. You adapt to change more easily than most people. And that's part of what keeps life feeling alive. There's always something to explore, always something new to discover. Yet in the middle of all that movement, it's easy to forget that some of the most important things in life are built slowly. A relationship, a family, a friendship, a small community around you, a sense of belonging. None of those things appear overnight. They're built through hundreds of ordinary moments that often seem insignificant at the time. The Six of Cups card carries the feeling of familiar things. The smell of food coming from an old kitchen. The laughter of people who have walked beside you through different seasons of life. A song you unexpectedly hear again after many years. An old photograph appearing on your phone screen. The kinds of moments that remind us life isn't measured only by accomplishments. It's also measured by the people who shared those years with us. Maybe you've been thinking about a decision lately, and part of you has been focused on the immediate questions. Does this make sense? Is this the right time? Should I do this? Yet sometimes the larger question lives somewhere else entirely. What is this choice building for the years ahead? What is it nurturing? What is it protecting? What kind of foundation is it creating? Because some decisions bring instant excitement, and some don't seem particularly dramatic at all. Yet over time, they create a kind of peace that lasts much longer. The Four of Wands card appears here like the image of a home with a light still on when you return. Not necessarily a physical home. Sometimes it's a place within yourself. A place where you can finally set your bag down after a long day. A place where you don't need to prove anything, don't need to move faster, don't need to become someone else. You simply get to be there, to belong, to breathe. The older we get, the more many of us realize that the things we truly want aren't always the things that impress people the most. Sometimes the most valuable things are much quieter. Stability, trustworthy relationships. The people who are still there years later. The peace of waking up in the morning knowing you're building a life that aligns with what genuinely matters to you. Gemini has always had the ability to see many doors. This part of the story feels less focused on the doors themselves and more focused on what's waiting beyond them. Not just opportunity foundation, not just change, but what that change has the potential to grow into. Some seeds don't bloom on the day they're planted. Yet, beneath the surface, they're still growing. And sometimes, when we're patient enough to look a little farther beyond the present moment, an entirely different perspective begins to emerge about the path we're walking. There's a very particular moment in life that we rarely recognize while it's happening. It's the moment when you're no longer the person you used to be. Not because your appearance has changed. Not because your career has changed. Not because life suddenly takes a dramatic turn in a completely different direction, but because the way you see things has changed. You still drive the same roads. You still wake up in the same room. You still spend time with many of the same people. Yet somewhere deep inside, something has shifted. You begin thinking a little farther ahead before making decisions. You start caring more about what has the potential to last. You begin to understand that not everything valuable needs to arrive quickly. Years ago, Gemini might have been drawn to whatever felt new, whatever felt exciting, whatever made your heart race a little faster. And there's nothing wrong with that. Most of us go through seasons like that. We get pulled toward unexpected opportunities, interesting invitations, possibilities that send the imagination wandering far beyond the horizon. Yet as we grow older, we often discover a different truth. The things that create a lasting life are not always the things that create the strongest excitement on day one. Some things grow slowly, like a tree planted in a backyard. On the first day, there isn't much to look at. A week later, not much has changed. Even a month later, it may seem almost the same, yet years pass. And eventually, that same tree becomes the source of shade for the entire yard. That's the feeling carried by the Knight of Pentacles card in this final part of the reading. Unhurried, quiet, not trying to prove anything to anyone, simply continuing forward, one step, one day, one small task at a time. This may not be the kind of energy people talk about very often online. It doesn't create sensational stories. It doesn't create moments that make everyone stop and stare. It feels more like someone quietly building a home, adding another brick each day, adjusting part of the blueprint, completing another task that needs to be done. Very few people notice while it's happening. Until one day the house is standing there. Gemini tends to move quickly through thought. You adapt quickly. You respond quickly to change. Those are beautiful qualities. Yet this final chapter seems to offer a gentle reminder that strength is not found only in speed. Sometimes strength is found in staying with what truly matters, staying long enough for something to grow, staying long enough to see the value of small efforts, staying long enough for what you're building to take root. The Four of Wands card appears here like a peaceful scene, after all the thinking, all the weighing, and all the choosing. Not as a final destination, but as the feeling of stability beginning to form. Like returning home after a long journey, you set your keys on the table. Take off the shoes you've been wearing all day. Open a window and let fresh air into the room, and suddenly realize you no longer need to keep running. Not because life has become perfect, but because you know you're moving in a direction that feels aligned with what truly matters to you. Maybe that's the real gift. Not that everything unfolds exactly according to plan. Not that every challenge disappears, but the quiet trust you begin to feel in the road beneath your feet. Trust in the more mature version of yourself. Trust that the things built through sincerity, patience, and consistency carry a value that doesn't need to be rushed. Looking back across the entire journey of this reading, the feeling that remains isn't pressure. It's relief. The relief of someone who has finally given themselves permission to move forward, without needing to know every turn ahead, without needing to see the entire road. Simply knowing that you're carrying enough wisdom, enough experience, and enough growth to continue the journey. And sometimes that's exactly how a new chapter begins. Gemini, perhaps the most beautiful part of this reading isn't finding the perfect answer. It's realizing that you don't need to have everything figured out before you move forward. You've spent enough time listening, enough time reflecting, enough time understanding what's been unfolding inside of you. The rest may begin with something very small, but something honest. And if there's one thing worth carrying with you after today's reading, let it be trust in your own voice. Thank you for spending this time with me. And if any part of this story resonated with you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. I genuinely love to hear your story.